There is a strange moment that almost no one admits out loud. It happens when a real opportunity appears. Not a vague fantasy, not a distant, maybe someday. Something concrete. A door opens. A project could finally begin. A chance appears to change the level of your life, and in that moment, something inside you pulls back. It isn't lack of ability. You know you could try. It isn't lack of intelligence. You have thought about this dozens of times. And it isn't lack of desire, because the uncomfortable truth is that you do want it. You want to grow. You want to stand out. You want to prove something to yourself. But even then, you hesitate. Then something curious begins to happen. Your mind starts producing elegant explanations. This isn't the right time. I need more preparation. Maybe later. But underneath all of those thoughts, there is a quiet question you keep avoiding. What if I actually succeed? Most people believe the greatest human fear is failure, but there is another fear that runs deeper. Harder to admit. The fear of growth, the fear of discovering what you are truly capable of. Because as long as you remain full of potential, everything still feels safe. Potential doesn't demand exposure. Potential doesn't demand responsibility. Potential doesn't demand that you sustain real results. It allows a lifetime of elegant postponement. You can always tell yourself, I could do it if I really wanted to. That sentence works like a psychological shield. It protects the ego. But it also builds an invisible prison. Now imagine a simple scene. Not a man staring at a broken mirror, not someone doing push-ups alone in a dark room, something much more ordinary. A man sitting in his car, engine off, parked outside his workplace. He has already arrived, but he still hasn't stepped out of the car. The phone is in his hand. He looks at the screen, locks it, unlocks it again, then locks it once more. Because today there is a decision waiting, a conversation that could change the direction of his career, a promotion request, an idea he has been thinking about for months that he might finally present. Nothing dramatic, nothing impossible. And yet the heart rate increases. The mind begins whispering. What if you're overestimating yourself? What if you're not as good as you think? What if people realize you're not really that capable? So he stays there a few minutes longer. The strange thing is that no one would see that moment as important, but psychologically, it is. Because inside that parked car there is a silent confrontation between two versions of the same man, one that continues exactly as he is, and another that accepts the consequences of becoming more. Most people believe fear appears when we are about to fall, but many times fear appears when we are about to rise. And this is where the most uncomfortable question of this video begins. How many decisions in your life were quietly sabotaged, not by the fear of failing, but by the fear of discovering your real potential? This kind of escape is subtle, almost sophisticated. You continue working, you remain busy, you keep planning, but the stronger version of you never arrives. It stays just slightly ahead, always later, always when things are more organized. But there is a problem with that. Unused potential does not stay still. It begins to pressure you from the inside. First comes restlessness, then frustration, then a strange feeling that is difficult to explain, that life could be bigger than it currently is. And if you have ever felt that, there is a strong chance this video is for you. Because in the next chapter, we will examine something most people never confront honestly. Why human beings, even when they see their own potential, develop psychological mechanisms to run away from it. If this level of thinking is rare where you are, subscribe to the channel. This is not a place for shallow motivation. This is where we analyze the internal structures that determine who you become, and what you are about to understand may completely change how you interpret your own life. Because sometimes your biggest obstacle is not lack of opportunity, it is something much closer, something inside you, that has learned how to escape its own greatness. When someone begins to run from their own potential, they almost never notice it happening. From the outside, life still looks functional. You work, you solve problems, you fulfill responsibilities, you maintain the appearance of stability, but internally, something begins to shift. Your energy starts to drop. Not physical exhaustion, something more subtle, a form of psychological fatigue. You begin avoiding certain thoughts, certain ideas, certain possibilities, because every time they appear, they bring a dangerous question with them. What if I could actually do more? This is the moment when many men enter a quiet internal conflict. On one side, there is a force pushing toward expansion, a drive to grow, to test yourself, to become something larger than what you are now. On the other side, there is a powerful psychological mechanism trying to protect you, the ego. But the ego does not only defend you from failure, it also protects you from exposure, because growth makes you visible, and visibility has a cost. When you remain average, very few people pay close attention. But the moment you begin rising above that level, something changes immediately. Expectations increase, criticism appears, comparison begins. And the human brain interprets all of this as risk. That is why many people develop something strange over time, resistance to their own growth. They do not say, "I'm afraid of becoming more." They say things that sound socially acceptable. "I don't want too much attention. I prefer a simple life." Success changes people. Sometimes those statements are honest, but many times they function as psychological defenses, a sophisticated way to justify retreat. Because growth demands something most people are not truly prepared to accept, responsibility for their own capacity. The moment you acknowledge that you possess real potential, the excuses disappear. You can no longer hide behind the belief that you simply never had the chance. Now you know the possibility exists, and that the decision to act also exists. This creates pressure, a quiet psychological pressure, and many people resolve that tension in the simplest way possible. They reduce their ambition, they begin lowering the internal standard, the goal stops being excellence. It becomes stability, the goal stops being expansion, it becomes comfort. In the short term, this creates relief, but in the long term it produces something far heavier, the sensation of wasted potential. This feeling rarely appears dramatically. It shows up in small moments. When you see someone doing something that, deep down, you know you could have attempted as well. When an idea you once imagined appears in the hands of someone else. When you realize that life kept moving, but you remained at the same level. This creates a particular type of frustration. It is not the frustration of failure, it is the frustration of invisibility, the quiet sense that something inside you could have existed in the world, but never did. And here is an important psychological detail. The human mind often prefers a limited identity over an uncertain one. Being an ordinary person is predictable, but becoming someone who attempts something significant is unstable. Because there is always the possibility of discovering two uncomfortable truths. Either you are far more capable than you imagined, or the work required will be far greater than you expected. Both require change, and change demands energy. So many people enter a quiet state of strategic accommodation. They keep living, they keep working, but the scale of their attempts becomes smaller and smaller. Not because they are incapable, but because growth forces them to confront something most people would rather avoid: the responsibility of existing at their highest level. If this kind of thinking is rare where you live, consider subscribing. This channel is not built for quick entertainment. It is for those willing to examine the mechanisms shaping their own lives. Because in the next chapter, we will confront something even more uncomfortable. There comes a moment when the old version of you stops working. And when that moment arrives, only two outcomes are possible: reconstruction or silent decline. There comes a point in life when the old version of you begins to fail. Not dramatically, nothing explodes, nothing collapses in public. From the outside, everything still looks functional, but internally, the structure begins to strain. The same habits no longer produce the same results. The same conversations feel strangely empty. The same goals stop generating real energy. At that moment, many people assume something is wrong with them. They think they lost motivation. They think they are burned out. They think maybe they have simply changed. But what is really happening is deeper than that. The identity that once organized your life has become too small. For years, it worked. It protected you. It created stability. It gave you a role in the world that felt manageable. But at some point, that identity begins to collide with something inside you, a quiet internal pressure, a difficult awareness that you are operating below your real capacity. Once that awareness appears, two reactions usually follow. The first is restlessness. You start to feel that something needs to change, but the direction is not clear, nothing feels fully defined. So small experiments begin. New ideas, different routines, thoughts about changing direction, sometimes even the beginning of a bold plan. But alongside that movement, another reaction appears: resistance. Because rebuilding your identity requires something very few people are prepared to face: the space between two versions of yourself. You are no longer fully aligned with who you used to be, but you have not yet become the person you are capable of becoming. That space is uncomfortable, it is uncertain, and often it is lonely, because the world around you is still interacting with the old version of you, the predictable version, the familiar one, the version they already understand. When you begin to change, even slightly, that stability breaks. Some people do not understand what is happening. Some react with subtle skepticism. Others prefer that you remain exactly the same, not necessarily out of hostility, but because one person's transformation often disrupts the balance around them. And here lies a danger that many people fail to recognize. When this period of transition appears, the discomfort can easily be misinterpreted as failure. The mind begins negotiating. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe I should just go back to how things were. Maybe this ambition is unnecessary. And slowly, the person retreats. Back to familiar routines, back to smaller goals, back to the safer version of their life. In the short term, that decision reduces tension. The inner conflict quiets down. But in the long term, something heavier begins to form. Because once you have glimpsed a larger version of yourself, it becomes very difficult to erase that image completely. It stays with you as a silent reference point, a possibility that never fully materialized. This creates a specific kind of internal tension. Life continues, responsibilities continue, but somewhere in the background, there is a persistent sense that something remains unfinished, that something inside you was never fully built. This is why many people describe this phase as confusion. But confusion is not the most accurate word. What is actually happening is restructuring. Something inside you is attempting to reorganize your identity. The real question is not whether this pressure will appear. It appears for almost anyone who carries real internal ambition. The real question is different. When the old version of you begins to collapse, will you rebuild something stronger, or will you retreat into something smaller? I'm curious about something. If you're watching this right now, write the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how many people, in different places around the world, are going through this quiet transition. Because in the next chapter, we are going to confront a dangerous trap. When this internal shift begins, many people start blaming everything outside themselves. Life, the system, circumstances. But at a certain point, that explanation becomes something else entirely. A very sophisticated form of escape. When this internal pressure begins to grow, most people instinctively search for an explanation outside themselves. The environment, the economy, the system, the lack of opportunity, bad timing. Sometimes these factors are real. Circumstances do shape parts of life. Ignoring that would be naive. But there is a subtle moment where observation turns into something else, justification. And once that shift happens, progress quietly stops. Because when the mind successfully convinces itself that the real problem is external, the sense of internal responsibility immediately weakens. If the system is the problem, then what can you really do? If the environment is the barrier, then waiting becomes reasonable. If circumstances are unfair, then withdrawal begins to feel justified. This logic provides emotional relief, but relief has a cost. It slowly removes your power to intervene in your own life. Over time, a narrative begins to form, a quiet story you tell yourself. In this story, you are someone with potential, but permanently limited by external forces. It is a comforting identity, but it is also a trap, because while that story protects your self-image, it quietly erodes your agency. The truth is uncomfortable. Growth rarely happens in favorable conditions. It happens when someone decides to operate differently inside the same conditions. This is where discipline enters the picture, not the version people usually imagine, not intense bursts of motivation, not emotional speeches. Discipline is far less dramatic. It is structural. It is the ability to act in alignment with a long-term direction even when the mind begins negotiating for comfort. Because the mind will negotiate, constantly. It will suggest delays. It will invent rational explanations. It will try to convert temporary discomfort into a permanent retreat. Without internal structure, most people eventually accept those negotiations, and slowly their lives become smaller, less demanding, less ambitious, less alive. But discipline interrupts that process. It requires 3 forms of control that are rarely developed consciously. The first is cognitive control, the ability to recognize sabotaging thoughts before they take control of your decisions. Not every thought deserves authority. Many are simply emotional reactions disguised as logic. The second is behavioral control, the ability to act even when internal resistance appears. Because action often creates clarity that thinking alone never will. Waiting to feel ready is one of the most efficient ways to remain exactly where you are. The third is emotional containment, the ability to experience fear, doubt, pressure, and uncertainty without allowing those emotions to dictate your direction. Fear does not disappear when you grow. In many cases, it becomes stronger. The difference is how you interpret it. For some people, fear is a stop signal. For others, it becomes an indicator that something meaningful is at stake. Without these forms of internal discipline, potential slowly decays. A person may still possess intelligence, still possess ability, still possess ideas, but without structure, those qualities never stabilize into consistent action, and over time, something subtle begins to happen. Ambition shrinks, expectations lower. Life becomes organized around comfort instead of expansion. The most dangerous part is that this reduction rarely feels dramatic. It happens gradually, quietly, until one day the realization appears. You did not become who you were capable of becoming, and by then, years may have already passed. In the final chapter, we will close the loop that began at the start of this video. Because running from your potential is not just a psychological habit, it is a decision that quietly creates two different versions of your life. And at some point, one of them becomes permanent. At the beginning of this video, we talked about a quiet moment. A man sitting inside his car, the engine off, the building in front of him, a door he could walk through, but hasn't yet. From the outside, it looks insignificant. Just another morning, just another decision, but psychologically that moment represents something much larger, a point of divergence. Two versions of his life are possible from that exact moment. One version stays inside the car a little longer, then turns the engine back on. He tells himself it isn't the right day, not the right time, maybe later. Life continues, nothing collapses, but nothing expands either. Weeks become months, months become years. The idea that once carried energy slowly fades into the background. The potential remains, but it never becomes reality. The other version of that man does something very simple. He opens the door, steps out, walks inside. Nothing dramatic happens immediately. No applause, no instant transformation, but internally something important shifts. He stops negotiating with the voice that tells him to stay small, and that shift begins a different process. Because real reconstruction does not start with inspiration, it starts with elimination. Some internal narratives must disappear. The belief that you must feel confident before you act. The belief that clarity must come before movement. The belief that growth will somehow feel comfortable. None of those ideas survive real expansion. After elimination comes structure, not excitement, structure. Daily behaviors that support your direction, environments that reduce distraction, commitments that force consistency. People who operate with similar levels of responsibility. Without structure, potential remains imagination. With structure, potential begins to convert into competence. And over time, competence reshapes identity. What once felt risky begins to feel normal. What once felt intimidating becomes routine. The version of you that once seemed distant slowly becomes familiar. This is how real transformation happens. Not as an emotional explosion, but as a steady reorganization of behavior and identity. Fear never disappears completely. Doubt never fully vanishes, but they stop controlling the direction of your life. Now return to that moment in the car. The difference between the two futures was never the absence of fear. Both versions felt it. The difference was the next action. One chose comfort, the other chose movement. And every meaningful life is built from decisions like that. Small moments where a person stops running from their own capacity. Because the greatest risk most people face is not failure. It is living an entire life without seriously testing what they could have become. Avoiding that fate does not require perfection, it requires direction, and the willingness to move even when certainty is missing. If this message resonated with you, there is something important you should do next. On your screen right now, the next video is appearing. It will take this conversation deeper and show you what happens when you begin confronting the mental limits that have quietly shaped your life for years. Watch that next video, because recognizing your potential is only the first step. Learning how to sustain it is where real change begins.